Hi, this is Paul. Not very long ago, a conversation between Jonathan Peugeot and Jordan Peterson dropped. And I knew there would be stuff in this. The teaser deals with Dawkins. Jonathan Peugeot has on his Patreon, if you're a patron, I don't know at what level, I'm a patron of a sufficient level for Jonathan that I could watch it. And it was a very interesting, I thought it was a good video on, a little complex, a good video on Peterson's conversation with Dawkins and where that went. And so this video starts out with a little teaser about that. One of the things that Peugeot nicely nails in that Patreon video is that of category. That, you know, the category of dragon, category of predator, category of lion, all categories are dependent on that which are not facts. Now, I think that this conversation of Peugeot and Peterson reminded me touched on some areas of the conversation that we just had with John Vervaeke and Jonathan Peugeot. And John Vervaeke nicely talked about that. Facts sort of go back and forth. And okay, here's this point made by Vocal Distance in my conversation with him 6 months ago, which is really critical. And if you and he and Vervaeke are listening to the same philosophers with this and have figured something out about what facts are, and there are no facts without the world that they live in. Yeah.
We used to have men who would read the Saturday Review of Literature and quote Archibald MacLeish when they were discussing things with
Yeah.
NASA.
We still
We used to
have
have
those
that.
men. We just don't send them to the House.
Or the Congress.
Or maybe they're smart enough not to go.
They're on YouTube and TikTok.
Yeah. Oh,
He's right there. He sees it. He sees the problem.
Yeah.
It's already beginning to show up. And so what he's seeing is, so Searle talks about the background, the network, and the network of intentionality is all the ideas, all of your intentional conscious content, right? Everything that's about something, dreams, visions, ideas, thoughts, goals, all the artifacts of consciousness, the things that furnish your conscious world and your ideas. That's right. Intentionality just means ofness or aboutness. So anytime you have a thought of something or about something, that's intentionality.
Yep. Okay, and so he's calling that intentionality, and like this world of facts lives in there because it's about anytime we have this thought that's thing. So those are sort of again, I use Amazon boxes as sort of I just recycled on my Amazon boxes. Amazon boxes is sort of an image of what people imagine facts are. They're these little discrete things, and you can pile them up and make things out of, or you can pile them up and figure out reality. But again, as Vervaeke had mentioned, it doesn't really work that way.
He's saying you have a network of intentionality, all of these intentional bits of intentionality of knowing things and feeling things and having thoughts about things and imagination, and all of that forms a network of intentionality. And that gets meaning up against a background. And the background is a set of capacities, things like knowing a language, having a prefrontal cortex, being able to see, having senses, the capacity to use language, the ability to think. And the background, and he says this in his book on perception, he says there's no hard and fast line between the background and the network, just like there's no hard and fast line between a tree and its roots.
And right there's no hard and fast line, which means that facts actually sort of go back and forth from the network into the background. And that's what you see. Let's use again the example of a lion or a predator. Jonathan Peugeot used an example of two different animals that we both associate as lions, and he made the point that these animals actually aren't interoperable. They don't mate together. And so then why do we use lion for them? And of course, lion isn't necessarily the distinction between whether an animal can or cannot mate. But part of the problem again is network and background, and they go back and forth. And that was part of the point that Vervaeke was making. And again, part of the point that Vervaeke was making was that this is actually coming out of science, and it's also coming out of cognitive science now as when they thought, well, here's a computer, and then we'll stick a camera on, and then the computer can see. And basically, if you're driving a car that has some degree of automatic driving, they might have little, so Tesla removed a bunch of the sensors. They have cameras on everything, and they have computers on those cameras. And what they have now trained those cameras to do is identify the background from the network. And the network would be like lines in the road, or a deer coming in, or a car in front of you. Well, what on earth does line and deer and car all have to do with one another? A deer is a mammal. Lines are tiny little bits of paint on the road that go in a certain direction, and they're identified by how they go because they're often different lines. And a car is different. So you've got a line, a deer, and a car, but we have trained these cameras to differentiate line and deer and car are all important for, this is where you get the relevance realization. And and that's why this idea of facts has sort of broken down. Because is the line a fact? Yeah, the line is a fact. Yeah, but so is the road. But the road isn't a relevant fact. The lines are the relevant fact. The camera isn't looking for the road. The camera needs the road. The camera needs the car, but all of these things are sort of in play. All right, so we looked at that. And then let's go back to here. And again, Peterson has been talking about sacrifice. And he's been talking, and you'll hear him make the same point about sacrifice when I play this again, because Peterson, of course, is also become a popularizer. In other words, he has a message that he's trying to get out, and you have to get that out through repetition. And that's also part of who Peterson is, because I had that wonderful conversation with, I can pull it up.
Listening makes the real, which is what John said. Active listening
is one of the most important things you can do for people is just simply to listen to them.
Mm-hmm. Listening makes the real, which is what John said. Active listening.
Okay, did you hear that? It's almost garbled in there. The mic didn't turn. Listening affects the real. And you'd think, no. Listening, how would listening affect the real? Well, again, we're into this strange world of cognition and reality that is just getting stranger and stranger. Again, people want to sort of push it off and say, no, science has that all set. And it's, no, actually, it's science that's pushing this thing.
Listening. Gene Genlin says people don't even have a story till you listen to it. And what I learned from John at the cafe is people have a false story. And I reckon I likened it to like a pump, an old-fashioned pump, that you got to keep pumping until the water runs clean. And then what John would say is, at that point, people save themselves.
Yes. And so I think a lot of what Peterson is doing is, in fact, repeating the story and pumping until the water runs clean. Now, in this conversation, again, Peterson's been working on this idea of sacrifice, and sacrifice is founding for the community. Sacrifice, I mentioned in this video, the sacrifice of the son of the man who decided to rebuild Jericho. His oldest son is sacrificed by the setting of the foundation, and his youngest son is sacrificed by the setting of the gates. Now, the language in the Bible doesn't say that he put up an altar and actually physically sacrificed his son to lay the foundation. That could have been what happened. Because, again, when you look at the founding of cities, sacrifices are involved. Here is a picture of the groundbreaking. Now just notice what we do, and we don't think anything of it. This is the groundbreaking of the building that would be Northside Community Chapel. My sister has this sign in her kitchen right now. We rescued it, and somebody saved it when they replaced the sign at church, and it's come all the way down to my sister. And a number of these men are pastors in the area and people who have been working on this. And you'll see African American who sort of leaned over. His name is Bob Clark. He passed a number of years ago. My father is standing right behind him in the clerical collar. He was a young man in his 20s at that point, but they are breaking the ground. Now, in the ancient world, there would have probably been a blood sacrifice. And here in this, again, why do this? Everybody knows that you're not actually going to use shovels to dig the foundation. You're going to get some kind of excavator there to do it. But why do you sit there with a shovel and you take it? In some ways, the little bit of exertion forms this tiny little sacrifice in the ground. And there's something deep within us about this.
That waking up is painful. Like you can be in the most sweetest dream, but you know what? Reality can also wake you up from the worst nightmare. It does both. And you can't hold them up.
Now, you got to give Jonathan Peugeot a break here. He didn't say it when we had the kit, when we were recording, but he told me, he said, I was up late watching the elections. And so poor John was a little groggy. Jonathan was a little groggy during this conversation.
Apart. That is a fragmentation, a bifurcation of the realness of reality given to us by the Enlightenment. And this is what it's falling apart. One of my most recent papers on why you can't naturalize relevance realization. The paper that Anna Riddell and I have.
When he said that, you saw me head for the keyboard. You can't naturalize relevance realization. What exactly does that mean? That is so interesting. And it's so interesting in terms of the development of what John has been doing. And again, I loved what Esther Meeks said. I mean, one of the things that we do is we keep talking. We keep pumping the water until it runs clean. Esther Meeks keeps writing. Is my sound down? Oh, I hope not. Ugh. Well, hopefully it wasn't down too long. It's up now, so readjust your volume. We keep talking until the water runs clean. We keep working it through. We keep trying to do that.
Submitted on rationality and relevance realized. The understanding that reality is not just risky, because that means we can calculate it and tame it, but fundamentally ontologically uncertain, ontologically complexifying, ontologically demanding, and that we can't actually ever come up with the view from nowhere picture that tames it all for our egocentric concerns.
That is the myth of the idolatrous myth of modernity destroyed right there. We cannot tame reality. We cannot tame reality from within. Peugeot has a really excellent illustration with respect to Dawkins and the virgin birth, that Dawkins believes in a virgin birth. He just believes in the virgin birth of the universe. And Peugeot makes the observation that you cannot explain a system. You cannot account for the system from within the system. And this is where, again, Esther Meek, when I always put an S on the end, Esther Meek, at the end of our conversation, and like one person they bumped into, it was hair. And they realized, and you think, to knowing hair. There's no bottom to knowing paint. And what this act does actually is sort of open a door that Augustine opened, which said that actually it is all about the order of our loves, because God made this world so rich that if you love paint, if you keep drilling down into paint, you will find God. And it's like, and that's exactly what creation is about.
Let me commend Doorway to Artistry, where I finally feel like I've done a responsible job in figuring out how I know. So now I can finally start to love reality. So now I call myself an exuberant realist. But so doorway to artistry is attuning your philosophy to enhance your creativity. And so that has to do with our views of reality and our views of how we know. And so this is my first time to do metaphysics, which is what I'm calling a metaphysics childhood, but it's just classical Christian metaphysics, and I feel like it's the doctrine of creation. So I talk about the ising of things. So in other words, things showing up. The most remarkable thing about you is that you're here.
Yes.
Right? I mean, it's utterly astounding. Well, that just is the Lord's let there being. It's his ising. And there's nothing underneath.
We think we have something's we've got reality, but also when we're shocked and surprised, Hiroshima, we think, oh, that's reality. And it's because these are not right. And what we try to do is we try to cleave the one off. The Buddha talks about this too. People, I want to be free from all the dark stuff and just give me the candy. And you can't do that. That's not how reality works. If reality only confirmed and comforted you, it wouldn't give you what you most need from reality, which is being real, which is it exists in its own right, independent of your egocentric projects and concerns. Not antagonistic. I'm not saying that. I'm not a Gnostic, right? But I'm saying like what you most need from reality is that it can anchor meaning in life, that it can like I want to be connected to something bigger than myself. I want to be connected to something beyond my egocentric preferences. And what do they mean by bigger? They mean I'm in my dream, and in my dream it seems real. And then I move to the waking world, which is bigger and realness is always a comparative realization. And that waking up is painful. Like you can be in the most sweetest dream, but you know what? Reality can also wake you up from the worst nightmare. It does both. It does both. And you can't pull them apart. That is a fragmentation, a bifurcation of the realness of reality given to us by the Enlightenment. And this is what it's falling apart. One of my most recent papers on why you can't naturalize relevance realization. The paper that Anna Riddell and I have submitted on rationality and relevance realization. The understanding that reality is not just risky, because that means we can calculate it and tame it, but fundamentally ontologically uncertain, ontologically complexifying, ontologically demanding, and that we can't actually ever come up with the view from nowhere picture that tames it all for our egocentric concerns. But this is part of what I mean by the advent of the sacred. That's what I was trying to get at, the beautification and the glorification, a reapprehension. And that word has two meanings, right? I'm playing on both of them. A reapprehension of realness. What our society suffers from, one of the things driving it, is our society is really crap at realness and getting worse at it, and people are starving. But they're not starving in the caloric sense because they're filled like with junk food, but they're starving in the malnutrition sense that their health is suffering and therefore their resilience. Look what happened in COVID. We saw that the culture has almost no resilience to the significant slapping of reality in our face. Look what's happening at the university. When I started there, there'd be one or two students a year coming into my office and crying. I now get 5 or 6 a week. Like the resiliency is gone. The resiliency is gone. And you don't get resiliency without reverence to realness. Maturity is about facing up to reality. Listen to the metaphors. They're trying.
Okay. When he talks about maturity there, that's a Peterson theme. And what Peterson will say is you don't get maturity until you understand and practice sacrifice. Practicing sacrifice builds a life. Practicing sacrifice builds a world.
To teach us something really profound.
It's interesting because the idea of the sacred as I mean we kind of went down this road, so I think it's good to explore it as well. Like this idea that the sacred has a blood aspect to it or has a suffering aspect to it, and the I think for sure childbirth is one of those moments, right? So it's like we know that we are born into the world in pain and screaming and blood. Like this is something.
I'm reading through the book of Deuteronomy with my men's group, and the dedication of the firstborn. You have first fruits of the land, from the field, of the trees, those first fruits, but you also have the first fruits of the womb. And right there in Genesis, of course, you have the ground is cursed and the womb is cursed. And so what happens in Deuteronomy is you give the first fruits to the Lord. And altars are transporters. Now, Jonathan's going to talk about Star Trek in a minute, but altars are like transporters because the Lord is up in the heavens and we're down here, and the altar is a grounding. So you connect the ground, and we have the question of why stones that are not touched with iron tools. Well, that's a really interesting question. But you build the altar, and then normally that firstborn belongs to the Lord, so we'd put the firstborn on the altar, but no human sacrifice. Abraham, no human sacrifice. Isaac, a lamb, a ram by the horns is put on the altar. So there you have the substitute. The animal substitutes for the human. So the opening of the womb, the firstborn goes onto the altar, but not the firstborn, an animal substitute. And then what happens? Fire. Fire is what's on top of Sinai. That's the presence of the Lord. Fire is what's in the burning bush. Fire plus animal creates the fragrant aroma. You can find that repeated again and again in the Torah. The animal, in a sense, goes up to the Lord. And if, of course, with a whole burnt offering, if you keep that fire going, the animal will eventually be consumed. And, well, where did the animal go? It was transported all the way up to heaven. That's what altars are. And altars for us are sort of the initial understanding acted out, the initial mythology of what sacrifice is. That's what the word means.
That is there at the origin of each of us, and then also if you think of the rituals of initiation rituals, whether it's circumcision or baptism, these are all rituals that are related with a type of engagement with blood or death, or all of this. And it's fascinating to think about that, because in some ways, I mean, I do it. Obviously, I do it. Like, I love my children, and so you want to make their life easy. Like you don't want to make their life difficult, because
the adult sacrifices for the children, because the adult goes and earns the money and puts food on the table. The adult goes and earns the money, puts clothes on their back. The adult goes and earns the money, sends them this tool. The adult keeps sacrificing for the children. And already notice how sacrifice has already been changed into other behaviors. First, the adult sacrifices an animal. The animal gets sacrificed for the children, and the animal goes up because that firstborn is dedicated to the Lord.
Because you're trying to kind of, you're trying to pave the way for them, trying to open up doors for them. You want to give them opportunities, but you realize to what extent.
Because that's what you sacrifice for. You sacrifice to open a new world. You sacrifice to build a new world.
Extent we're kind of stuck. Like the idea of a Star Trek world, right, where everybody is just basically rational and self-accomplished and everything, doesn't seem to be right in terms of what humans actually need.
I love that scene. I mentioned it in the video. I love that scene in The Matrix when Agent Smith is torturing Morpheus to try and get the access codes to Zion. Oh gosh. And he explains that, well, when we bottled you all up and made you into batteries, the first world we gave your mind was one perfect world where there was no suffering, and you destroyed it. It's exactly the point that Dostoevsky makes in Notes from the Underground. We know that isn't real, and because meaning for us is more important than comfort, we will actually destroy the world to bring back suffering. Because we know that without suffering, we are not connected to something. And we're not connected to something real. And we long to be connected to that real thing. And again, I'd say that realist thing is God. It is the source of all reality, is the source of all being. But we long to be connected to God, which is why people will do risky things, people will do suffering things, and now Jonathan's going to talk about the gym bros.
Some type of pressure, some type of difficulty, and some contact with a numinous terror in order to give us the right grounding, for us to be able to move forward.
And it's why you take someone who is wealthy and affluent, and what do they want to do? They want to explore, and they want to explore something dangerous, something mysterious. They want to Google exactly what room do I have to go into the Del Coronado in San Diego, so that if I sleep there, I can experience the terror of the numinous, which is a ghost. Again, listen to Nathan Jacobs as he's walking through this stuff. Read Clay Rutledge. It is not, once you make people happy and rational in this way, they will seek out the numinous. They will do it. They don't stay away from it. And in fact, I would argue that most of the people who are out there promoting this myth of the modern, that you can get the view from nowhere and you can arrange all these little Amazon boxes and you can have exactly the suffering-free life you've always wanted, those people are all seeking that world because of something they have suffered. And so it is fact, the terror of suffering and the avoidance of suffering, that they are seeking this, but that negative utilitarianism just doesn't work. And, you can listen to base camps, and basically, people who go there, they become anti-natalist.
And it's difficult. There is an interesting idea that maybe at this point in time we have to be even more deliberate about that. I mean, when I think of the gym bros, I get a sense that that's what they're trying to do. It's like, life's easy, make it hard, right? It's like, this Jocko Willink like approach to reality. This idea that if you like, give yourself challenge, give yourself opposition, right, in order to create these little sacred moments of exertion and exhaustion and success. I don't think it's enough. I mean, I don't want to knock the gym bros. Like I love the gym bros, but there's something superficial. But it seems like there's a need to make this more deliberate. And I like Martin Shaw and Paul Kingsnorth. By the way, like this is in passing, but it's worth mentioning. I watched Paul Kingsnorth First Things speech. I know you posted it, Paul Vanderklay, where Paul basically goes after civilizational Christianity and kind of goes after Jordan a little bit, and Ayaan Hirsi Ali and all these people. And it's weird because it's so weird. Like I totally welcome that. Like I totally welcome what Paul's saying, because we absolutely need that. We need someone to say, "Hey folks, this is terrifying. Hey folks, this is hard. Hey folks, this is going into the desert and starving yourself, and like this is I totally love it. But this is the paradox. The paradox is that it seems to yield a world, right? So the negative aspect, right? This kind of destructive aspect or deconstruct. The saint of Saint John the Baptist saying, basically clear the road, like destroy it all, like just reduce it to rubble, right? That this sacrificial aspect, this baptism, seems to yield a positive world. So I don't know, like I don't know how to. I mean, I have little ideas, but it seems like there's that aspect of it that we have to be aware of. How can we, in a world where everything is easy, create, or not create, but participate in the more terrifying aspect of the sacred in a way that is affording, like that way that transforms us,
I always chuckle when Jordan says, go find the hardest thing you can find, the heaviest thing you can find, and lift it. And as a pastor, I think these things find you. You seldom have to go looking for them, because the ones that you pick up voluntarily, yeah, I get the whole valence about the voluntarily, but the truth is, and this is where I know we started with Advent, we then sort of, okay. So again, pastorally, this is it. Sam just did a conversation with Ashley Land, who She's been on Justin Brierley. She's been in a number of places talking about her experience with psychedelics and why she gave them up. Her and her husband were deep into them. At this point in the story, her husband is already sort of going to church, but she's not going with him, but she has a Christian friend.
In the palaces of a Turkish prince. He said something like that, like how can I even be among these people? And so there is this weird, turned off of Terence McKenna because he was talking about, how can I go out, I'm paraphrasing, but how can I go out and be among these people, like the plebes who don't have this experience, when I've like been in the palaces of a Turkish prince. He said something like that, like how can I even be among these people? And so there is this weird, there's this, for all the talk about ego death, there's a lot of ego inflation, like a lot. And
ego that gets inflated by how much your ego has died.
Right. Yeah. It's ironic, isn't it? Yeah, exactly. And I absolutely had that feeling like, well, it's nice that she has her little beliefs, but she hasn't had the experiences that I've had, even though so many of those experiences were like some of those experiences were downright traumatic. Like for a while, even after I quit psychedelics, there were certain experiences that I didn't, just made my palms sweat to even really think about. So really traumatic experiences. And yet I still had this delusional arrogance. But that friend, Carrie, who was a Christian, she, around that time, she had a son that was a little bit older than my son. And then she had a 2-year-old daughter named Joella. And Joella started getting ill. At first, it seemed just like a normal childhood illness. She ran a fever for a few days, but then the fever kept going. It didn't go away. And she had some bleeding on her gums. And so finally they took her to a doctor, but finally they were able to get a diagnosis, and it was leukemia. And she, I think from the point of diagnosis to her passing away, it was just like 3 weeks. So just incredibly heartbreaking, devastating. And that really shook me up. I mean, it was terrible. That really shook me up. And also thinking of that in terms of the New Age belief systems that I had embraced. And I could not stand the idea of her not existing anymore. There was no, like I said, there was no redemption in those ideas. Absolutely no redemption. Like it just felt like, okay, if I want to continue believing those things, then for Joella, this is just the end of the story, dying in pain. And I'm sure they made her as comfortable as possible, but there was suffering involved still. Like this is the end of the story. Like now she'll just be absorbed into this ocean of consciousness, absorbed back into the all. And there was absolutely no solace, no comfort in that thought. And so that really had a profound effect on me. And also witnessing the way that Carrie and her husband grieved, and that I think it's in Thessalonians, like they grieved. They did not grieve as those who had no hope. Mm-hmm. And I couldn't help but contrast thinking of, what if this happened to my child? Like, I don't even know what I would do. I would have no grounds for hope for the future if this happened to my child. I would have no category sufficient in my belief system to handle this.
Or maybe even some fear that it had been your fault, right? Through that sort of manifestation, dark logic.
Exactly. Uh-huh. Yeah. So that all those threads were kind of converging at the same time, and I was really breaking. Yeah.
So then what happened?
Yeah. So
I remember you mentioned you were at the funeral. Was there a song during the funeral service that really caught your attention?
I don't remember if they played it at the funeral service, but Carrie we kind of stayed in touch afterward for, I don't know, 6 months to a year. It's hard to remember the exact timeline because it's been so long ago, but she had told me in one of the emails she sent me that the hymn "It Is Well" with my soul had really ministered to her and her husband, and they had actually performed it at their church maybe 3 to 6 months after Joella passed away. And despite, like I said, growing up in the church somewhat, I didn't remember ever having heard it, or if I heard it, I didn't pay attention, And so she had encouraged me to listen to it, and I put it on a playlist on Spotify, and I forgot about it. And then there was a spring day where, like I said, I absolutely reached the end of myself. I had reached the end of my hopefulness in psychedelics. Oh, and also another thing that happened was, like I said, I can't remember the exact timing with this. I think it was after Jola passed away. I decided that maybe the problem, and this is kind of a sub strain of thinking in the psychedelic world, some people are only into natural psychedelics. And so I thought maybe the reason that I cannot have a good experience on LSD anymore is because maybe LSD is bad, which is just this desperate rationalizing, trying to figure out. And because like I said, I loved LSD. That was my favorite psychedelic. But I thought maybe that's the problem. Like maybe LSD is impure because it's created in a laboratory, and I need to go back to mushrooms. And so I actually grew my own mushrooms.
Just sacrifice harder and it'll
exactly. Yes, exactly. And so I grew my own mushrooms, and I remember I would pray over them. And when I say pray, I mean I would I don't even know what I would say. I would use some of my yoga chants that I knew, like the Sanskrit that I didn't even necessarily understand. And I just thought, there again, I thought if I can purify them enough, if I can infuse them with love and light, and I'll be guaranteed to have a good experience again, to reclaim that initial high, that initial euphoria, that initial sense of freedom. And so yeah, we had a night. My kids at that point, we had my daughter too, and we had a night to ourselves. And I thought, okay, this is it. And we blended them up and we drank them and sat there for a while. And, I got the feeling, oh, maybe they weren't good. Maybe they didn't happen. And then it hit me like a ton of bricks. The room started changing. The walls started breathing. Like the colors started running down in a waterfall. And immediately I just had this horrible sinking feeling in my gut. Like, not this again. It was this sense of dread, like, not this place again. I'm so sick of this. Like, there's nothing good about this place. There's nothing fruitful about this place anymore, if there ever was. And I remember I had a bad trip, a pretty bad trip. I just felt like everything was collapsing. Any meaning, that was left, and there wasn't any meaning left in the world. Everything was collapsing. Matter was collapsing. Meaning was collapsing. Nothing meant anything anymore. Nothing mattered. And at one point, I remember, my husband tried to encourage me. He was fine. And at one point, I kind of rallied myself, and I thought, I'm going to find God. And I started, the rental house we were in at the time, it had 2 bedrooms and then a Jack and Jill bathroom. And I remember I started pacing through this circuit around the living room, the bedroom, bathroom. And I felt like God was eluding me. And it was this really sorrowful feeling. I mean, it was absurd that I thought I could if I could go fast enough, I could catch God, But then it also felt like I was this train on a track, and I couldn't escape it. It was bad. It was a bad experience. So after that, I actually had some mushrooms left that were growing in the basement that I was going to save for the future, and I think they got overtaken with mold. Like, I opened the styrofoam cooler and they're just covered with mold, and I was like, I don't even care anymore. And at that point, I was definitively done. I was done with psychedelics. I was done. And so anyway, fast forward to that day on the porch where I put on that playlist with It Is Well on it. And my children were playing on the porch. It was this beautiful spring day. And my children were playing on the front porch. And I wasn't even necessarily listening to the music that was playing. But all of a sudden, and I can only describe it as like God, snapped me to attention when that song came on. And I actually listened to the lyrics and what it was saying. And I remember at that point, I had conceded to going to church with my husband. But I felt like I couldn't penetrate the mystery. Like, I couldn't understand. And part of the problem, I'm sure, was I was going at it from these new age angles. I was still kind of going at it from
You'll
this
make
is
sense of this inside your perennialist
right. Exactly.
box.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's what I thought. Like, this is something that I'm going to kind of shoehorn into this other system that I already have going, even though that system wasn't working. But I couldn't seem to understand it. And I remember sitting there on the porch that day and looking at my children and thinking about Joella and thinking about how precious my children were to me, and how what an undeserved gift they were. And hearing the lyrics of that music and hearing about my sin nailed to the cross and I bear it no more, and just I started weeping, and I felt like I finally understood, not necessarily by this intellectual mechanism that I finally understood. And another thing is, in the New Age world, there's no concept of sin. Insofar as there would be some kind of a concept of sin, there's just like, we've forgotten that we're perfect. We've forgotten that, we just
ignorance is the sin of your true inner divinity.
Exactly. Exactly. So, but I had felt over the preceding months and years, I'd felt this heaviness with that, because on some level I knew that wasn't true. Like, that wasn't all that was wrong with me in the world. Like, there was something more foundational here. Like, there was something from the very bottom that was cracked, and so I knew that, and I had a growing sense of that. And so it was such a relief to be able to say, like, oh, like, yes, like, the world is fallen, like, I am broken, like, this is true. I can acknowledge this. I don't have to pretend anymore. And it was just a really beautiful moment, and such, like I said, such a profound relief and true freedom from all of these things that I had been pursuing that had become increasingly imprisoning, like we had talked about earlier.
Right. So
there's a lot of interesting contrasts in there, in terms of, because you would think owning up the acknowledgement of your own brokenness and the world's brokenness, and of course the memory of your friend who had lost that child, this horrible loss, that somehow the weight of sacrifice and the acknowledgement of both the sacred has to go all the way up and all the way down. All right, now I'm running out of time, and so I'm finally get to what I had wanted to get to.
Say too that the parent who makes that offering will be able to tolerate the fact of the child's demise if the higher order structure above the nation is intact, so that the war is just, and it's just because it serves the eternal verities, and those are unified in something ineffable that sits at the top of the hierarchy. I mean, that's the story of World War II. I mean, there's many stories of World War II, but the fact that it was perceived and was inarguably just war meant that sacrificial offering was justified in a way that would stop it from being traumatic. Still terrible.
And the reality of human sacrifice, right, is one that has existed forever. And we have to be able to understand it.
Yeah.
If we understand the mimetic structure, we can understand that human sacrifice is something that did, in fact, preserve groups. And I hate to say it, like, it worked. Because you implied much earlier that every act we take is a sacrificial act. And some of that representation that emerges in the religious text is actually the propositionalization of the fact that human beings learned that you could make sacrifices and that would stabilize the future. Yeah. That's what you do when you work. Yeah. But in the biblical story, then you have this weird situation where ancient cultures did practice human sacrifice. Like, they would kill someone publicly, visibly, in order to bind the group together, to show that we're willing, we're going to offer this thing up. And this is something that, by the way, even in the Middle Ages, you had these stories, like, if you know about the assassins, for example, in the Middle East, and these Muslim jihadists, that the leader would ask one to just jump off just to show. It's like, you want to see how tight we are? you up there, kill yourself. And they would just jump off into the pit and kill themselves. And it would bind everybody together. Everybody would be like, yeah, like we're holding together towards this purpose.
In my conversation with Mark Parker today, he talked about, Roman legion's decimation. If your legion broke, the commander comes and, every 10th of you, the rest of the legion has to kill the 10th. And that binds the legion together. And now they won't break anymore.
See, the idea that human
sacrifice,
sacrifice is just a ridiculous superstition. Like, it works. Now, how do you go beyond it? And I think that the story of Abraham starts to show that, right? Is that Abraham doesn't kill his son, right? That there's something that if you offer
that's part
to
of
the
that,
highest.
That's part of that translation of action into abstraction. It's like, so imagine that there are corporeal sacrifices that people act out. And then there's a realization at some point that that pattern of sacrifice can be duplicated psychologically, can be duplicated spiritually. Yeah. So it no longer, so the idea would be that if you sacrificed appropriately at the psychological level, you wouldn't have to sacrifice corporeally.
Yeah, or you could say,
that's for sure that's
true.
So
you could say, imagine that if let's say, if people all sacrifice to the very highest good, right? To the love that is the foundation of reality, right? The infinite goodness that is foundation of reality, then we wouldn't have those other sacrifices.
Yeah,
we wouldn't go to war. Like, we wouldn't have to literally sacrifice our children up. And so it's normal that the structure of that story looks that way.
Okay, so then one of the things I'm trying to wrestle with in this book is, so I make the equation between work and sacrifice and attention and sacrifice. Yeah. Okay, so now we know that the world is founded on sacrifice. The community is founded on sacrifice. Why? Because you have to give up yourself to be part of a community. By definition, that's what constitutes maturity, is the giving up of yourself in relationship to your family and the broader community, and then all the way up Jacob's ladder. It's a sacrificial process. Then the question, once you understand that, another question emerges, which is, what is the form of sacrifice that's most pleasing to God, so to speak? Or you could put it a different way, which is, what's the pattern of sacrifice that has the most profound effect? And that's actually what the Bible explores, is that it's continually exploring the sacrificial pattern that establishes the proper covenant with what's highest. And you can say, well, there's nothing that's highest. It's like, well, then you're in the dust problem. It's like so molecules aren't real, but atoms are. But atoms aren't real because like subatomic particles are real. It's like, you can't do that. You can't just dispense with the higher order.
If you read C.S. Lewis's Pilgrim's Regress, this is one of the videos I thought about making today, and maybe I'm not going to be in the office for a few days, so there aren't going to be any videos. So that's why I have all these videos stacked up in no wait, no ads, so that I'll just peter them out into the channel as I go. But C.S. Lewis has this wonderful image in the Pilgrim's Regress of the spirit of the age and the prison of the spirit of the age. And that's exactly what Jordan Peterson says right there, that when you're in the prison of the spirit of the age, you don't see people, you just see their molecules. And then if you stare far enough, I don't think he actually goes this way, but first you see, well, let's say the skeleton, but then, obviously if you're to keep going in that, well, you see the skeleton and you see the digestion and you see, and then you imagine that it's all just a machine. And then actually reason, who is imagined by Lewis as a woman on a horse, comes and slays the spirit of the age. But of course, John, the pilgrim, is not done with his journey. That now suddenly he can see these realities that are there. He can see that sacrifice is foundational for a productive world. He can see that the stack goes from the bottom, the ground upon which the altar stands, all the way up to the heavens, which is the recipient of the offering. And a little bit more, and then we'll be done.
Structures.
Yeah, because all structures are higher order structures.
Right. And there's no canonical reason to put a limit on that upward pattern of organization.
Yeah, and I think that's the trick often that is posed by the secularists or the atheists, right? Is to want to they find some cap. I don't know where it is.
Yeah.
Sometimes it.
Oh,
it'll
I
say,
know where it is.
Whatever,
I get my whim now.
Yeah, whatever permits me to just do whatever I want.
Yeah,
That's the
Michel Foucault.
Yeah,
in a
that's right.
bloody nutshell.
Yeah.
Right. He turned his entire intelligence, which was substantial, to solving exactly that problem. Where does the meta narrative end? At the level of my desire. Well, and then where does the need for power come from? Well, if the meta narrative ends at the level of my desire, then I'm going to be quite the creature to play with, because it's all about me. So what else do I need along with my hedonism? The capacity to use the force necessary to compel you to go along with my whim. And then Foucault would say, like the other postmodernists, there's nothing but whim anyways. There's nothing but whim and power anyways. Right? Yes. Devastating.
Yeah,
Destructive.
So I think that the things that you're intimating, in your book, and that you're intimating in the way you talk about it, is that we start to notice that this very structure, the structures that bind reality together at every level, they don't stop at the human level.
Yeah.
They go up, and you can see them in the way that humans bind together, that are analogous to even to human bodies.
I think I think you should rephrase that and say that the idea that they stop at the human level is an indication of the pathological effect of a kind of Protestant Enlightenment individualism that assumes that the human being is the capstone, the individual human being conceptualized as an alienated and isolated human being is the capstone. And the problem with that is that it's not that the individual is subordinate to the higher order structures. It's that the individual properly construed is the harmony that exists at all those levels simultaneously, all the way up to the highest aim. And so who I am, it's like I am a father. It's like there's an I that's playing that role. It's no, not in the least. Like that being a husband, being a father, being a citizen, those are parts of my identity, right? They're my extended identity, and the higher that extended identity becomes, the more solid it is as an identity. And it is definitely the case that as we've lost those superordinate identities, that we're collapsing into multiplicity and dust, right? Into the alphabet mob, for example, right?
Well, the more real your entire world is, because then your world is populated by all of these aspects, and the more people are in this world, and the richer the world. That doesn't obviously eliminate the sacrifice. It's all part of the same thing. All right, I have to be done, so leave a comment.